Hi, this is Scott Bradfield in episode 2 of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub, and you'll be relieved to know or to notice, as I'm relieved to tell you, that I'm not in the bathtub this time. I'm out of the bathtub and I'm in my office, and I'm going to carry on discussing the topic of my first lectures, which is a topic that actually made me want to do these lectures when I read books like this, if only to help myself remember what they're about. And the topic is finishing Thomas Pynchon's Against the Day, reaching the end, reading all the way through this 1,100-page, incredibly dense, brilliant, beautiful book. But it may not look brilliant and beautiful when you start it at page 1. I wanted to start with just a little demonstration, which is that, as you can see, this is what they call a door stopper. It's the sort of book I never want to read usually. When I see a door stopper book, I think it should be a door stopper when it's that big. And this is definitely, like most of Pynchon's books, I would say that he's a man who's actually specialized in writing door stoppers. This one actually holds a fairly solid door open in a room. My office is quite windy, which normally needs quite a heavy door stopper. So I just wanted you to see that and to understand that that's one of the things that often makes us think a book is good, is that it's just big. Now, you'll have to excuse me here because, as I've said, as I've promised, these are going to be very poorly choreographed films. And I wanted to show you the other place that I read great books, and sometimes not so great books, and sometimes just okay books. Some of the best books are just okay. And that's my chair. Lucy found a couple of these kind of inexpensive Barcalounger type chairs. And it's in my new office here in San Luis Obispo. I remember when my son was growing up and we used to read every night, one of the few things I taught my son, or I tried to teach him, was that the most important thing about reading books is getting comfortable. Because you need it is a comfortable, pleasurable experience. So if you're not in the bathtub, you need a good chair, and having a good chair has always been sort of important to me as a reader. I wanted to start by talking about why I hated Thomas Pynchon for many years, and when I sort of learned to love Pynchon. When I was a young man, and when I was first going into college, the big writer in the 60s and 70s who was written about probably more often than any other writer in that period by academics was Pynchon. And he wrote 3 novels in the beginning of his career. The first was V. I tried to read this 3 or 4 times. I stopped about a third of the way through each time. I find it an incredibly boring book. It's naughty. His prose is like twisted. There's funny bits. There's really funny moments in the books. And just the prose was just so clever and over annoying. And the second book, Crying of Lot 49, which I've learned to be Pynchon's most well-read book, mainly because it's his only short book. I think this is the only thing saving this book from oblivion in a way. It's another naughty. The prose, I'm hoping that in the future, if these continue, and they're really just basically whether I can keep myself doing them or if I enjoy doing them, I would like to read passages from these early books and maybe make my case that I think these are just terribly written books. He then went on to write Gravity's Rainbow, another book. I think I got 50 pages into this several times. Never liked this book. It's the sort of book, again, it's another door stopper. And Pynchon was known in his mysterious life, as he likes to keep himself quite mysterious, as someone who liked to write several books at a time. And he had lots of different books going at once. And his early books feel like that. They're frozen. There's lots of clever ideas, and the narrative is just frozen, and there's lots of clevernesses in them, and some funny passages. But the prose is so laborious and so twisted that I just can't get myself through his books. But most people, what they do is when they read these big books, they tend to get 3 or 4 other books describing what's happening in that book, because reading the actual book is kind of hard to do. For example, the most common example of that is James Joyce's Ulysses, a book I would like to do in this series, which has more books written about it than the book itself. And you actually feel like you need those books to help you understand them. At least I did. Now, about Gravity's Rainbow, he went silent for a long time. Was notorious for trying to write several different books. One of which I would argue is Mason and Dixon. I don't have a copy of Mason and Dixon. It's another big doorstopper book. It's this overly super intelligent pastiche on historical novels, and I read all the way through it. I don't remember anything that happened in that book. My belief is that while he was working on these books and having a miserable time writing them, that's my personal fantasy about Thomas Pynchon, he got so sick of writing this really twisted, clever, super intelligent crap that he sat down and wrote a book called Vineland, which is about a bunch. It's about the end of the 60s, during the Reagan years. It's a very beautiful, funny, complicated, but narratively just absorbing book. It takes a lot of concentration, like all his late books do, to follow it, but it's a very beautiful book. It's a very emotional book. The prose is very different. His prose changes completely in Vineland. And I've for a long time seemed to be the only person advocating that people go back to read this wonderful book. I've reread it several times, and it was always kind of dismissed as a minor Pynchon novel. Now that book came out, and I would like to read that in this series as well eventually. And then it kind of got disregarded, sort of. And then Mason-Dixon came along. It was impenetrable. It required lots of academics to explain to you what was happening in it. And that kind of got him back on the tracks for the quote, the great American novelist. Now, after Mason and Dixon, Pynchon went on to write Inherent Vice, which is, like Vineland, an extraordinarily beautiful, funny book. It's a sequel in many ways to The Crime of Lot 49. It's set in Southern California. I'm going to argue that Pynchon is one of the greatest writers of Southern California there is. He writes beautifully about Southern California, and with a kind of romantic glow. And the detective novel was a perfect venue for him. It is one of only 2 books where he stays in one point of view throughout the book, and I think he does it masterfully. And unlike The Crying of Lot 49, where the kind of everything sort of disintegrates into this kind of, entropic universe of, this clever entropic universe where everything disappears, you don't know what's happening. This is a beautifully structured book. And the story, what's his name, Zoid? No, Doc Sportello. Zoid is in Vineland. Doc Sportello, the detective in it, who basically walks around like Pigpen in this haze of marijuana smoke, is a wonderful character, as are many, many characters in it. And this, I would like to reread this. It's one of my favorite books. He also, in that period, I can't remember, I think he wrote this, I think this came out before, I believe this did come out before Inherent Vice. He wrote a book that I sort of avoided for many years called Against the Day. This is the one where I'm trying to finish now after it's pretty much 8 months I've been on and off this book. And Against the Day is an interesting book because it's sort of a mix of those large doorstopper, super complicated novels of Pynchon's youth and these kind of fluid, narrative, beautifully composed books with hundreds of characters, close to 100 significant characters who show up in more than one scene, who actually are part of this large, complicated plot, which I can only summarize briefly, which is it's sort of a Dos Passos-like vision of America at the turn of the century. You can almost sit down and, if you want a historical reference, read this next to Hobsbawm's Age of Revolution, because it has real characters coming and going. Mother Jones is in one scene. You have, Pancho Villa, I think Madame Blavatsky's at one point. All these different historical characters kind of come in and out of scenes, but they're mainly driven by this, hundreds of Pynchonian, hilarious, moving, funny, complicated characters, framed by two sets of characters, really. One is a guy named, and I may get these names wrong because, as I'll try to explain, I can't remember all of his book. A guy named Webb Traverse. The names are always fascinating. Webb Traverse, who's kind of an anarchist and bomb thrower from the Union, fighting for the unions in Denver at the turn of the century. And Traverse is murdered by a big Koch brothers-like plutocrat evil billionaire named Scarsdale Vibe. And after his death, his family starts to proliferate through the book, trying to get revenge on him and getting involved in the Scarsdale Vibe universe and so forth. And they kind of take you through the book, and they meet all these many other characters. On top of them is this sort of boys' adventure book group of characters who are out of no boys' adventure book you've ever read, and that they're a group that live on a gigantic balloon called, I think it's called the Inconvenience. And they have names like Darby Suckling and Chick Counterfly, and they're in a gigantic balloon floating through the world, going to the World's Fair at one point, 1893, the World's Fair, and then going off in these various adventures all over the planet while World War I is being built, is kind of boiling to fruition, and all of these unions and the creation of huge amounts of capital on all these people working in mines and in crappy jobs, and the Scarsdale Vibes trying to buy up all the energy of the world and turn it all into their profits. There's this huge Dos Passos-like universe of industry and building, and then all these individual characters running through that universe. Now, I had hoped to actually start to read a little bit from this book, but just describing it for a minute has become quite complicated. So I will probably save them. I'll do a few more. I'm going to have to do 2 or 3 lectures just on finishing Thomas Pynchon's Against the Day. The premise of this course has been to kind of, the next time I start a difficult book, kind of take us through it and just discuss it as we're reading it as readers. I will say this, I would not recommend this as your first Pynchon book. I would strongly recommend Inherent Vice as your first Pynchon book. I don't think it's simpler, I think it's just a beautiful book. I might also think about another book I'd like to do, which is Bleeding Edge. I hate fiction that's trying to resolve historical conflict, try to explain history to us. And I don't think this book does it. At the same time, I think it's the one novel which seems to help us grasp the mess of 9/11 and what the conspiracies and counter-conspiracies of our culture and our media in these horrible events of our times. It's a comic detective novel, but it's grasping with a lot of that, and I would recommend that as well. But I would like to just finish off in the next couple lectures about what it's like to finish this difficult book. And I will say one thing before I quit. Again, I have to keep these lectures short, or I can't just download them without any problem. Is that it's hard to read a book like this because by the time you've given it the attention it needs on every page, you can't really remember what happened a week, 2 weeks beforehand that you read it before. And it's a very daunting book just to look at it on the shelf. And we're at page 50. You just think, oh Christ! The fact that it's beautiful is hard to say. It's hard to deny, but you can't even accept it. It almost becomes a job. Anyway, I'm going to stop now. I'm going to do a second lecture to finish off what I wanted to do, and that'll be, we'll move on to the actual book in the next lecture. Okay? Thanks.